Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Resilience, the one stop podcast by the youth for the youth as part of the Global Youth Summit 2023 Bridging Program, hosted by Group One, where we explore the path to building resilience in the post COVID-19 era. I'm your co host, Omar.
And I'm your host, Yael. And today we delve into a critical aspect of resilience, which is social life. So, just to clarify, the podcast series as a whole tackles the concept of resilience. And we thought it would be important in this episode to dive into this topic from the viewpoint of social life and how drastically different it looked for all of us during the pandemic and what it looks like now, post pandemic, and what lessons we can learn from that and implement it on whatever scale in our lives moving forward.
Yeah, so let's get right into it. Talking about resilience, especially social life was extremely affected during COVID-19, whether from, a sense of how sociable we are as humans in communities. Obviously, domestic violence was a huge factor. Religious life, work interaction, school interaction, child development, all those stuff were you know big things that we didn't notice and took for granted during our normal lives, and that were
Yeah,
completely different during COVID-19. So
yeah,
let's start with our personal lives, even.
yeah. So really, like, for me, my parents are really old, right? But my dad is 86, so I had to take. I hope everyone did, right? To quarantine seriously, but for me, isolation. Just the thought of bringing that risk home. No, I couldn't. So my social life didn't exist during the pandemic, at least for like 5 months. Seriously, I never left the house. And it did give me some sort of gifts, let's say, like spending some precious time with my parents. Like who knew they're kind of nice people. I was surprised too. No, I'm kidding. Love you, Dad. But no, being with them was completely different experience from what we used to have. Like we talked about it earlier, and you told that everyone was out and about doing their stuff, and all of a sudden everything stopped.
Yeah. And like, this is the beautiful thing about global collaboration and getting to meet people from all across the globe, is that you gain some insights from our conversations together that you never would have heard through news outlets or mainstream media. So, for example, our Korean friends told us that people in Korea, you know, don't go out as much because of the pandemic, because everything is more digitalized now and they don't have to go out as much. And, some people are less social. And it's impacted especially the younger generation, who haven't necessarily acquired all the social skills that they needed during the pandemic years, which were crucial developmental years for them. And that, with the rise in information overload and social networks, it's all been unsurprisingly linked to a rise in depression, rise in anxiety, and
Yeah.
more diagnosis across the autism spectrum. In another part of the world, Pakistan, for example, a friend of ours told us how, like, traditional holidays, we always want to talk about how COVID affected the way we live, but in this part of the world, the way they live affected how they viewed COVID. So traditional holidays were used as a way to regroup, reconnect, and establish some sense of much needed normalcy during the darkest days of
Wow.
the pandemic. Uh,
Yeah.
also, Amandine, our partner in this episode, told us about how there was a shift in the Cameroonian mindset regarding traditional medicine. They pivoted back to that more due to their lack of trust in pharmaceutical companies with everything going on with the vaccine. And people started, like, this culture, this gifting culture of, it was a trend of people
Oh,
gifting one another all these traditional medicine products.
that's amazing. At least we had that gift from pandemic. So
Mhm.
yeah, yeah. So there were some good parts to it, I guess.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, but uh, you know, now I think it's important to talk about a crucial issue which faced many homes during COVID, up to the point where the United Nations called it the shadow pandemic, referring to the sharp rise in domestic violence across the world. Uh, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah,
so shadow pandemic.
I've heard of it. term coined by the United Nations Secretary General because it was um, people were taken aback actually by how bad it was. As we've seen during the pandemic, domestic violence can actually take place in a lot of different forms, right?
Yeah, but before that, I think it's really important to clarify that domestic abuse isn't limited to a man-female relationship, right? Like it also happens towards children and men and also the elderly.
Mm,
But I believe what comes to mind when we think about domestic violence is like in the form of physical or sexual abuse, right?
yeah.
But really, it also comes like in the form of psychological abuse, which includes threatening, controlling, and many other, intimidating behavior as stalking, preventing your partner from leaving the house or not allowing any social relations with your friends, with your family, and
Mm,
maybe even threatening to hurt your family members, your friends, your pets. And actually, like recently, it's became really common to use intimate footage.
wow. Intimate footage.
Yeah, yeah,
That's a tough one. So if you don't
yeah,
if you don't do what I want, I'll share this with everyone you know.
yeah.
Mm,
Yeah, to use that against you. And also, there's financial abuse where one may prevent their partner from obtaining education or a job outside of the house or control just, the money of the household. And, your partner won't have access to it, which makes it really hard, especially if you have other family members involved, like
mm,
children or younger siblings. Yeah, just to walk out of the relationship in this kind of situation makes it very, very hard. And also, and that's something that's came up to light like recently about emotional abuse. Like maybe you've heard the term gaslighting because it's all over the internet. Like when we hear something, someone says to their partner, "You're crazy. I've never done that. I've never said that." Some sort of things like that. Also, insulting and criticizing. Many people have that in their relationship, but they don't even notice.
mm. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's definitely a buzzword that we've seen quite a bit on social media in recent years. And speaking of domestic violence, we were looking at stats, and 1 in 4 women feel more unsafe at home. That's 25% of the population. So if you grab, like, 4 random women from the street, sit them down at a table, at least one of them does not feel safe at home since the pandemic.
Wow.
And most common types of domestic violence were sexual harassment, physical abuse, and verbal abuse. And these stats are according to the United Nations Entity on Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women, or UN Women. And speaking of the UN and international efforts, this topic has been addressed more than a few times. There's tons of frameworks that have been made specifically
Yeah.
for domestic violence.
Yeah. So, like, one of them is the international framework of Council of Europe Istanbul Convention. That's an international convention to prevent and combat violence against women and domestic violence.
Hmm.
And it says here, the convention clarifies that violence against women and violence in the family are not a matter for the individual, but a phenomena that the state must eradicate through a comprehensive and integrated policy. So basically, governments got together and agreed that it's not on the individual, it's on you as a government to create action plans and coordinate between the state, the private sector, the education system, enforcement authorities, and civil society organizations, and all of those need to work together to end this form top-down perspective.
Hmm.
And actually, they're really trying to make it work because since the convention came into force in 2014, over 40 countries have signed the convention and over 30 have already ratified it.
Yeah, it's actually quite substantial. There's also CEDAW and CVOW, the two sister conventions. So CEDAW is the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and CVOW, Convention on the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And those are also two additional pieces of international framework. And just to clarify, these are what we call customary international law. So they're not legally binding, They're more etiquette in in international law, sort of unwritten rules that we should abide by. Uh, you know, more like manners. And so, like, what measures have governments taken to mitigate the rise in domestic violence, especially during COVID? Like, apart from the international agreements, which have been there for a while and are well established, and we all know, but we do see a high level of impunity in some societies across the world, which pushes us to come up with more creative solutions.
Right. So before we go to that, you mentioned impunity. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so impunity is basically the lack of implementation of a punishment for breaking the law. And that goes back to national legal systems. Some countries fail in implementing the consequences of you breaking a certain law, and that especially applies to domestic violence in a lot of countries. uh
Yeah, yeah.
so as I've understood from you, like, some countries have taken different approaches to try and curb the rise in domestic violence in recent years.
Yeah. So Australia, for example, has implemented a number of modifications to their family law in order to allow the justice system to better respond to cases during quarantine and COVID-19. So, for example, they allow the courts to first impose electronic monitoring requirement for bail, and second, conditionally suspended imprisonment orders. So, abusers won't be able or allowed to be in the house. And third, they enabled online filing of restraining orders. And also, they increased fine, extended limitation periods for restraining orders. So basically, they just adjusted the law to fit into pandemic and more specifically to quarantine. And also these days, many countries are funding shelters and other safe accommodation options for victims. And actually, another very innovative way to help, which I came across, which was about 17 years old Christina, and I'm sorry, I'm probably saying it wrong, Christina Pazzetko. She created a fake cosmetic online shop that offers a lifeline to help victims trapped in their homes.
Wow.
So that's yeah, that's really innovative.
The talk about
Yeah, correct.
creativity.
Yeah, yeah. um, well, to wrap it up, we tackled different aspects of social life and how they were affected by the pandemic. And finally, we delve a bit into domestic violence and its types, what measures certain states have taken to try and prevent its recent rise. And, we talked a lot, and it's certainly a lot of food for thought regarding this issue. So, Omar, what would you say takeaway messages for our audience to ponder on?
Well, I'd say that for anyone, man, woman, child, if you feel like you need help, if you Google anything about domestic violence, literally the first thing that comes up is Google asking you if you need help and telling you what to do. Also, you can always
Wow.
visit Women Against Violence Europe. That's Women Against Violence Europe. It's a website that has helplines to over 46 different countries. And on a more general note regarding social life, COVID showed us the importance of social life, but also how flexible we are as humans to adapt in many different ways in order to keep up with the circumstances while also answering our needs as intelligent, sociable beings.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
And well, that's all for today. Thank you to our listeners for joining us on this journey towards a more resilient future. Stay tuned for our next episodes where we will explore other aspects of building resilience in the post COVID-19 era with other fantastic hosts from the incredible Group One, the goated group,
Oh.
Global Youth Summit. Until then, stay innovative and stay brilliant. Peace out and
Thank you, guys.
have a fantastic day or night, depending on where you're listening. Bye bye.
Bye, guys.